Have you ever been playing your Game Boy Pocket and thought, gosh, this is fun, but I wish there was also something more advanced? Well, that's pretty good, but hey, now we're talking. And wouldn't you know it, it's what many would call the most advanced Game Boy Nintendo ever made. I disagree. But either way, the Game Boy Advance has developed quite a reputation for itself. I jotted down a few of the more common things I see people saying about it. Might have made one or two of these up myself. But if I can direct your attention to number 3, this is perhaps one of the more interesting reputations it has. A portable Super Nintendo, something that's not as easy to pull off as you might think. But the Game Boy Advance having a reputation as a portable Super Nintendo, I find to be very curious because there's a lot of people, perhaps even some of you, who love, and I mean love, the Super Nintendo, but who have never even looked at a Game Boy Advance before. Ha! Well, now you have. Check it off the list. Unless you watch my videos like this, in which case you're missing out. I got mad tricks that I do on here. But if you're a fan of the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy Advance is probably at least worth considering. Best case scenario, you will absolutely love it. Worst case scenario, well, hey, you still accomplished something. But I'd like to take it a step further and give the Sega Genesis a seat at the table, something I have a tendency to do. Not only because the hardware itself makes for a fun comparison, but also because Sega developed and published a good number of games for the GBA, since yeah, the days of making games for their own handheld consoles were long gone. Okay, so why don't we start with some of the more obvious stuff? The main reason the Game Boy Advance earned a reputation as a portable Super Nintendo is because it had a lot of Super Nintendo games ported to it, many of which were heavily promoted back in the day. I would remember. It was how I finally played all the way through Super Mario World. Total loser, right? But hey, I didn't own a Super Nintendo back then. As a result, the Game Boy Advance turned out to be a great resource for me and anyone else like me who missed out on some of these classics. Question is, are they still worth playing nowadays when you can not play them and just play them other ways instead? After all, in most cases, people consider the Game Boy Advance ports to be inferior to their Super Nintendo counterparts, despite the Game Boy Advance hardware being more capable in a lot of ways from a technical standpoint. Most notably, having a 32-bit CPU as its main processor, though that is a bit misleading as some of its other components were still limited to 16-bit. In any case, games built from the ground up for the Game Boy Advance could better take advantage of the system's hardware than the ports did. That said, the main issue people have with the Super Nintendo ports is that because the resolution for Game Boy Advance games is lower than it is for Super Nintendo games, GBA is at 240 by 160, whereas the Super Nintendo is at 256 by 224, with the end result being that some of the sprite work and visuals had to be reworked, typically not in a way that people would consider to be better. Definitely one of the biggest issues people have with the system, along with the console's sound quality, due in part to some questionable hardware choices, as well as how a lot of the music was constructed in relation to the hardware. The Game Boy Advance versions of games also tend to be brighter than their Super Nintendo counterparts, either with the color palette or just overall brightness. The difference is more drastic in some games than others. Contra is one of the more severe ones I could find. Many have guessed this was an effort to make the games easier to see due to the Game Boy Advance's screen being notoriously difficult to see in low light. Now, you could always just get a Game Boy Advance SP that has a backlight, known as the AGS 101 model, but if you prefer the feel of the original GBA, you're probably gonna need to get a little more hardcore, maybe with a headlight, or, as you might have guessed, by having the original model modified with a new backlit screen like this one here. A very common practice these days. Now, if you've got your lighting situation squared away, but still want to wear the headlamp for style points, you can just turn the light off and you are all set. Okay. But about those Super Nintendo ports, working in their favor, they often have some sort of extras thrown in, whether it be an extra mode or what have you. In most cases, it's not something that has people flocking to the GBA version is better side. One of the more celebrated additions I can think of is the Four Swords mode that was added to Link to the Past, which, much like the GameCube Four Swords game, is hoping that you really love owning a lot of GBAs and cables for them. Who wouldn't want more cables? Nevertheless, I still feel like a lot of people will find the GBA ports of Super Nintendo games to be perfectly playable. Not to mention darn cute. Just look at how small they are in comparison. Okay, but now I'd like to talk about what I feel is the biggest thing that distinguishes the Game Boy Advance from older systems like the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, which is just that. It came out at a far later time when the GameCube was current, and yeah, the gaming industry had changed a lot by then, both in terms of what was popular as well as new IPs that had been added. I mean, we were now living in a world where games like Grand Theft Auto 3 and Halo had many gamers saying meow. At the same time, the Game Boy Advance clearly took a lot of inspiration from the 16-bit era, making for an interesting blend between the two. Take the Minish Cap, for example, which uses an art style more in line with the Wind Waker, but in sprite work form, and an overall game that feels more like what fans of A Link to the Past were used to. It's actually pretty cool when you think about it, because it's sort of like the 16-bit era was able to live on in the following decade, but in a new way. The support that the Game Boy Advance got from Sega demonstrates this nicely as well. Take a quick gander at these games and tell me what you notice. Yep, these are basically different versions of Dreamcast games, and while sure they varied in quality, it was cool to see. Of course, Sega had plenty of other games for the Game Boy Advance. I always get Sega Genesis vibes from Astro Boy, which you're seeing here. It reminds me of Alien Soldier, and probably because that game's developer, Treasure, also helped work on Astro Boy. There was a port of the original Sonic in addition to the Sonic Advance series, a take on the classic 2D style Sonic games but with a decidedly different feel. Looking at video games historically, the Game Boy Advance also has a lot of what I like to call yeah moments, like the Wars series and Fire Emblem series finally coming to the US, something there was hesitation to do before, as games in these series were released for the Super Famicom in Japan, but not the Super Nintendo in the US because there was concern that Americans would find the strategy elements of the games to be too complex. But turns out we love them. I certainly love them. Not as dumb as I look, Nintendo. Not that that's saying much. But in any case, there were a lot of games for fans of the 16-bit generation to be found on the Game Boy Advance. And because I'm such a huge fan of the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, I'd have to believe that's why I'm also such a fan of the Game Boy Advance. Right up there with the fact they both have purple on them. But don't worry, if you don't like the color purple, at launch they also released it in purple. No eject button like the Super Nintendo though, that's a missed opportunity. But the GameCube's Game Boy player has one. We're back in business. By the way, the GameCube's Game Boy player is what I'm using in these clips of Advance Wars 2 here. But the GBA had a lot of great odes to the past, as well as some fresh new ideas to make it feel different and new enough to not just say, why bother? Might as well play the 16-bit consoles. Not that that'll stop some people from doing so. After all, it can't be helped that one of the biggest criticisms against the Game Boy Advance is that it had too many ports and not enough original games, something the Switch has also dealt with. I totally understand this sentiment. It's hard to argue with having new games made for a console. That said, I still think the Game Boy Advance was treated to really good new games of its own. Here you'll see some of my personal favorites, most of which are well regarded in general. But with that, those are my thoughts on the Game Boy Advance in comparison to the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. When you factor in the overall library and a couple of the drawbacks of the Game Boy Advance, I personally still think the Genesis and Super Nintendo are better consoles, but the Game Boy Advance still has a lot going for it. At the very least, I think it makes a great companion console, and heck, there's certainly plenty of fans out there who prefer it over the Genesis and Super Nintendo. Speaking of which, are you one of those people? I'd love to hear your passion for the console and why you think so if that's the case, as well as any other opinions when it comes to the Game Boy Advance. So with that, leave a comment down below and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird, oh yes. And he hopes that you like what he had to say.